Hello everyone and welcome to this video. In this video, we're going to be building off what we covered in the previous video where we got an introduction to directory traversal, sort of learned about, what causes the vulnerability and what the traversal process looks like. So in essence, we're just going to be taking a look at what we covered in the previous video, but in a more practical sense. And this video is very important because it'll clarify a lot of things that need to be clarified before we actually take a look at directory traversal vulnerabilities in real-world web applications. So this particular video has a lab associated with it, and this particular lab environment will provide you with a Kali Linux system, so you don't need to use your own. So pretty much to get started, just fire up the lab and it'll take you directly into a Kali Linux system. So why don't I do that, and I'll see you within the lab environment. All right, so I am currently within the lab environment, and as you can see, you will be provided with a Kali Linux system. The first order of business is going to be identifying the IP address of the target web application, and that can easily be found by opening up a terminal like so. And we can then, I'll just zoom in here, we can then type in the ifconfig command or any equivalent to identify the IP address of the Kali Linux system, specifically the IP address associated with the interface Ethernet 1. Now, in your case, your IP address will be different because the subnet will be different. But what you need to understand is the way the labs are configured is that the Kali Linux system, if it does exist, will always be on the second IP address within the subnet, and the target IP will always be, or the target web application or system will always be on the third IP within the subnet. So the point is that in your case, this value will be different. All you need to do is just copy it and change the 2 at the end to a 3, and that's the IP address of the target web application. So we can now open up a browser, and I'll just paste in what I copied there, and I'll change the 2 to a 3, and this is the target web application. So we are taking a look at BWAP, which is a deliberately vulnerable web application, but one that I really like using to demonstrate firstly, what directory traversal is all about. So we'll need to sign in. The default credentials are listed here. We'll just type them in. So B and bug, and I'll just click on login right over here. And now we are directed to the portal where we can specify the vulnerability we would like to learn more about. So I'm going to go to the bottom here under A7, and you can see we have two options. We have directory traversal via directories or directory traversal via files, or file access, if you will. So we'll click on the first one here where we have directories, and I'll click on hack. And as you can see, what happens here is it will list out a set of files, right? So these are individual files within a directory. So that begs the question, what directory are these files stored in? Well, if we take a look at the URL, we can see that we have the file or resource directory traversal2.php, and then we have a parameter that is specifying a directory. So this is a prime example of a directory traversal endpoint, or an endpoint that could be vulnerable to directory traversal. Now, in the case of directories, what this means is that the web application is designed, at least in some way or form, to list out the contents of a particular directory. And in this case, it looks like the directory name is documents. Okay, now one thing that I would like to highlight before we actually get started with the traversal is exactly what the ... means in the context of a file system. So if you've ever used Linux or even Windows, this traversal technique exists within the actual terminal, whether using Bash or Z shell, etc. So for example, I'm currently in my terminal. Let's say I'm in var www.html, the typical location where you'd find a web application. So what does ... mean? Well, it essentially means go a step back. All right. So it means that if I was to type this in, take me to the www folder. And if I increase the number of ... within the sequence, it would then take me to var and then the root of the Linux file system, which is what we want when we want to access a directory like etc password. So the only reason why you'll typically see, 3 to 6 or even more instances of the ... in a sequence is because the directory the web application is currently in may be that many levels deep. So right now I'm only 3 levels deep in terms of how far I am away from the actual root of the file system. So let me just show you this here. So I'll say cd And by the way, within the terminal, we need to specify CD here because we're changing directory. But based on how the web application works and how directory traversal works within web servers, we do not need to specify that, we want to change the directory. We just need to specify how many levels back we want to go. So let's say I wanted to go back to the var folder. What would I do, or what sequence would take me there? Well, I would say ... and I hit enter, and there we are. So you can see that's pretty much it. That's all directory traversal is all about. And when you see a long sequence of ... here, or one that probably is URL encoded or has some form of encoding or obfuscation, the only thing what that means is that you're either trying to bypass, input validation or anything like that, or in the event that the sequence is long, it just means that you, based on the actual endpoint, you are currently a certain amount of levels deep within the actual, Linux file system or directory structure. So the bottom line is, if I go into, let's say I go into a much deeper level here. If I say var, let's see what's in var here. We have var, let's say log. Do we have any any additional folders within log? We do. So let's say apt, and I'll just go a step further if I can. It doesn't look like they are, but let's say we go to etc and I say Apache. I believe we should have an Apache folder here. We have mods available. I don't think we can go much deeper than 3, but let's see what we can do here. So just looks like we have directories, but even in this particular case, we're still 3 levels deep. If I wanted to go to the root of the file system, then the traversal sequence would be ... and I hit enter, and I'm now at the root of the file system. So what typically happens is, this is what happens. So I now know that I can utilize this sequence to go to the root of the file system. And for good practice, you do not need to specify the exact number of traversals backwards in order to get to the root of the file system. You can easily just add a few more for good measure. So if I hit enter, you can see it'll still take me to the root, because the root of the file system is where it ends. That's the root, that's home. Okay. So what attackers typically do now is they're using this functionality to access files that are outside of var.html, or are outside of the folder where the web application is stored in, or are outside of the folder that is limited to the scope of what the web application can access in terms of files and directories within the actual file system. So what happens here is, for lack of a better demonstration, is we're essentially, just providing a traversal sequence and then saying, etc password. That's in essence what is going on here. And when we hit enter, you can see we're able to access the contents of the etc password file, which are typically restricted. A web application should never give users the ability to do this. And in this case, the attacker would have gained access to a system level file. Regardless of whether or not this file contains anything useful or important, this is a big no-no. So that's in essence what is going on the file system. And as I said, it's very simple to understand in terms of how to identify the vulnerability, and then of course how to exploit it to access a file that is restricted. Okay, so let's return back to BWAP, and we can see that this is pointing to a folder, which is no problem. And we can put in our traversal sequence in here. So I'm going to say ... and generally speaking, good practice is always 6 sequences. It's just a good practice, because it ensures that regardless of how deep it is, that you can always go back to the root of the file system. So I'll say ... and I think 5 is probably enough, but we can add the 6th one, and we hit enter. And you can see it takes us to the root of the file system. And based on this implementation within the web application, it displays directories. But we should still be able to access etc password in terms of the content. And yeah, so it looks like we can. And that's because this implementation just displays directories and the files within directories, and does not allow accessing of files, or does not reflect back the values of files. So while we may have reached the etc folder, and I can verify this by displaying that, you can see that it lists out all the files within the etc folder, but this is just one implementation. The other implementation that we saw was, again, if we go back to the portal, if we go all the way to A7 here, we click on directory traversal files. This is usually the implementation you'll see, where we have the parameter name, in this case, pointing towards a page, and then the page could be login.php, or it even could be, an image or something like that, or a blog post. But the point is that this is where we would put in our traversal sequence, and we can say, for example, ... and let's see what that displays. So I'm just going to close that. For some reason, I actually opened up another window, but that's perfectly fine. If I now say, so ... says this file doesn't exist. If I now say ... again, file doesn't exist. So that's the way the web application works in this particular case. Is this particular endpoint requires a file to be specified in order to verify that traversal was successful. So if I use 3 levels and I say etc password here, you can see that it displays the contents of etc password, which is, as I said, this is very, very dangerous. And if based on our current context and the way this vulnerability works, we aren't able to execute system commands. But what if we tried to display the contents of the shadow file, which stores Linux password hashes? Well, it tells us right over here, could not open that file because we don't have the permissions to access it. And that's because we're running under the same privilege context that the web server is utilizing. So in this case, it's most likely www data. So, I can also try and view what's stored within, let's say, the home directory. And in this case, because this implementation only allows specification of files and then reflects back the contents of the files, it'll say that that file doesn't exist. So, I can say, for example, in this case, home, actually a much better example would be trying to access root, but we don't have access to that. But if we try and specify right over here, so var www, actually, let's specify a couple more levels deeper because I believe we do need that. So let's go 3 levels deeper, and I say var www HTML. If indeed the web application is stored in here, I can try and say, index.php to see if we can access that. And indeed we can. Now, as I explained in the previous video, attackers will not just use this to access restricted files or system files like etc password. They can also use it to access files relative to the web application that, again, you shouldn't have access to, but could reveal more about the web application. So a good example of that, especially in the case of BWAP, and we can easily utilize the traversal directories functionality or vulnerability here. So if we go back to A7 and we click on directories, and let's just click on hack here, what we can do now is, because this is going to display directories and not files, we can say go 3 levels deep, and what we want to do is say, or actually in this particular case, if we go 1 level deep, let's see what's displayed. So that takes us directly to which is interesting, it takes us directly to what appears to be the actual root of the file system. But what that means is that from this point on, we can say var www HTML, and we can then say, for example, let's see if they, because of how BWAP works, it most likely has a file called config.inc, right? So I'm just going to say hit enter, and we would essentially use that. But let's try and see what's stored within the var www HTML directory before we do that. Okay, so this is what is stored in here, okay? And now from this point on, it looks like Firefox crashed, so I'm just going to restore that tab if I can. There we are. We're just going to try and find a sensitive file that could reveal, let's say, a password or something like that. But we can see that we have some interesting files that we can access with the directory traversal file functionality. So, for example, do we have any config.php or any config file? For some reason, Firefox keeps crashing when I get to that stage. But let me see if we have anything here. What I do know exists is the config.inc file. So we'll go back to the portal and we'll go back to the directory traversal files vulnerability here, or functionality within the web application. And I'll just remove this here, and I will say go 3 steps back, or traverse 3 levels back, and then var www HTML, and then we can say config.inc. And I hit enter, and you can see that it looks like that is displayed, and it provides us with the the actual credentials to log into the MySQL database. So you can see that it displays the connection settings, and under the connection settings, we have the username and the password, and the name of the password is BWAP backup. So this is just an example of, the types of impact an attacker could have, by exploiting a directory traversal vulnerability. So they can access restricted files within the scope of the web application that they shouldn't be able to access, like config files, which contain sensitive information, or they can also access system files, which are also, again, similarly dangerous, because, you can reveal passwords, you can reveal SSH credentials. There's, a lot of information that can be leaked or that can be breached, just through the use of a directory traversal vulnerability. With that being said, hopefully this clarifies a couple of things regarding directory traversal vulnerabilities, and that's going to conclude the practical demonstration side of this video. All right, so that was the process of identifying and exploiting a very basic directory traversal vulnerability, and the objective, as I pointed out in the practical demonstration, is to outline the actual process and give you a better understanding as to what directory traversal actually looks like when you apply it into, the context of a real web application or web server for that matter. With that being said, that is going to conclude this video, and I'll be seeing you in the next video.